welcome back, and please take your seats. Please welcome James Robb, President and CEO of the North American Electric Reliability Corporation, and Mark Mills.
All right, so we're reconvening. This is almost like having a pre-K class where we have to get everybody back and behaving. Conferences are like that in Washington. So let me begin with Jim, as they say, needs no introduction because 18, took over as CEO and president of the National Electric Reliability Corporation. For those of you who are not sophisticated about that organization, it was 60 years ago this year that we had the great Northeast blackout of 1965.
Right.
And that is what led directly to the creation of NERC, then the council, because we discovered a truth that shutting the grid down accidentally was a really bad idea, and they created independent reliability authority, which has been the gold standard on the planet, frankly. And as to my knowledge, there is no equivalent authority in Europe. The only authority I know of in Europe is a multi-country authority which was enacted around the same time you took over NERC to promote and push wind and solar onto, to facilitate, they didn't say promote and push, to facilitate wind and solar on European grids. In other words, they created an authority that would be called the Unreliability Authority for Europe, and we have a reliability authority for North America. So let's talk about the Great Iberian Blackout as a starting point, Jim, because just like the lesser blackout in terms of people put in the dark, geographically it was sort of similar to what happened in Spain and Portugal. I have my own opinion on what happened, and the forensics are still being unfolded, but what say you about the why, and then we can talk about what to do.
Well, I think the why you summarized, right? There's a lot of forensic work that needs to go on to figure out exactly what caused the situation and what allowed it to propagate. But just looking at the situation, there are a few things that come pretty clear to mind. The biggest one is that there was very little traditional generation operating at the time of the blackout. It's about 74% inverter-based resource, so that's wind, solar, some batteries, connect onto the grid through a microprocessor called an inverter, some hydro, and then some natural gas. And the great thing about hydro and gas and nuclear is that when you make electricity the old-fashioned way by boiling water, making things spin, you get this quality called inertia. And inertia is terrific at helping a grid maintain frequency. And when there's a disturbance on the grid, which happens all the time, inertia is one of those things that helps kind of restore the grid. It's a resilience measure called frequency response, restores it back to its target frequency level. There wasn't very much of that operating.
Right.
So that probably allowed the situation to cascade until it got up to France and hit a wall of inertia with the French nuclear plants.
That's right.
The other issue, and again, we don't know the answer on this, but there were a couple disturbances right before all the generation tripped off the grid. The one thing we know about inverters from our work looking at similar instances that happened in West Texas, Utah, Southern California, is that when there's a modest disturbance on the grid, oftentimes inverters will trip off.
And they trip counterpart inverters as a consequence as well.
And it just becomes a cascading thing. So if you look at the math from the grid operator over there, they lost about a third of their generation like that. And it looks to us like it could be an inverter ride-through issue. There's also been allegations that it could have been a cyber attack on the inverters because they are internet connected and
the power electronics
cyber protection. Sorry.
And the power electronics just happens to be dominantly manufactured in China.
China and countries that aren't necessarily friendly to Western values.
Yeah.
So there's a lot of work to be done as to what actually caused the inverters to trip, but there's something about the fact that we lost a lot of solar very quickly, and then we didn't have enough other stuff to restore the grid. The other interesting thing from Iberia is when it came time to blackstart the grid, which is the term we use to restore after a massive outage like that. They restored it on the backs of the French nuclear fleet and the Moroccan fleet, and then used the hydro and the gas system in Spain and Portugal.
Right.
Again, we know how to restore the grid that way. It's one of the issues with inverters right now is we really don't know how to blackstart a grid using inverters and inverter resources.
And so, of course, in the technosphere, that everybody understands that an inverter is a very big piece of power electronics, not unlike what all electric cars have, all electrical machinery have power electronics that convert the non-compliant, non-useful electricity into electricity that's essentially useful for a grid or a power motor or whatever. The problem is that what you hear is a lot of people talking about and hand-waving that, oh, we can solve this problem with technology, which is true in principle. You can imagine making responsive inverters, smarter inverters, more batteries to create synthetic inertia, all these hand-waving. I'm very technologically bullish. I think all that is true. I think it's possible. The problem is, you can correct me if I'm wrong, none of it exists today. We don't actually know how to build things like that. And if we want a reliable grid, we'll have to have things that operate reliably.
Well, I'll take a little bit of exception to that because we do know how to create.
You know, if you do, you're going to be wrong, but go ahead.
No, that's...
No, I'm kidding.
That's part of the fun of being up here. No, there are grid-forming inverters, and there are installations of them around the world. They're not without their issues. And one of the big challenges we always have in the electric grid with any new technology is you can study something in the lab, you can deploy, do a pilot on a grid somewhere, but when you try to scale it to the level of the North American grid, which is a terawatt of generation, typically in that translation from pilot to terawatt, we discover things that we don't understand. And then we have to figure out how to model them and how to kind of operate them in the grid. So I think it's very possible to be there, but it's going to take a while.
Well, I think we're saying the same thing. I mean, grid forming inverters that create synthetic frequency response, synthetic, you do it digitally. This is all, we've known, we've been able to do this for decades. At scale, because this is the thing about grids. Grids, by definition, for societies are at scales that are astonishing. And that doesn't just require this ability to manufacture at those scales. To your point, when you start implementing things at that scale, you get new phenomenologies that you didn't anticipate. The scale generates the phenomenology.
Exactly. I had one great conversation with the head of grid operations for one of the major utilities, and he described having a file in his cabinet called Stranger Things, which are when things happen out on the grid that they don't understand. And eventually they want to kind of go through all those to figure out what you learn from them and then funnel that into their operating procedures. But you don't really want to have a lot of uncertainty in the control room. You kind of want to know what's going to happen when you push this switch and that switch and when this generator fires up and so on and so forth. So removing uncertainty is a really big thing to keep the grid operating stably, reliably.
As you know, this is the Iberian blackout is obviously a reminder that we want to remove, not add uncertainty, which is not a knock on the ability, especially in places like Spain, where you have a lot of solar resource, quote unquote. That's not the issue. In fact, I thought the most artful excuse or explanation for the Iberian blackout was to say, and I forget who said it exactly, it wasn't the solar power that caused the blackout. It was our inability to manage the solar power that caused the blackout. I said, well, it's actually truth in strict terms, but that's the point.
I think that's right. Plus, I think we're going to learn a lot about the value of diversity of resources on a grid. Diversity is absolutely reliability's friend, and also the role of inertia. You know, we've been very, very concerned as we've been losing kind of traditional spinning mass generation over here, replacing it largely with inverter-based generation, that, you know, eventually we're going to run into issues of not having enough inertia on the system, which can be provided by traditional power plants, synchronous condensers, flywheels. There's lots of ways to do that. But, you know, having something that kind of keeps that grid operating over here at 60 hertz, 50 hertz in Europe, with a very, very tight margin. I mean, that's kind of the miracle of the large-scale power grid, is that we can control it within such tight tolerances, and we need to, because if we get out of whack with that, motors start tearing themselves apart and everything else. So it's a really big issue for us to kind of figure out as we kind of continue to evolve this grid going forward.
Well, as you know, out of whack means that...
That's a technical term.
Yeah, exactly. I like technical terms. So as you go upstream of this, you actually, as you know, can destroy generators. The assets get physically destroyed. You can cause fires.
Right.
It's the destruction at the power levels of maintaining this balance that we're calling inertia. And I'll confess, of course, my bias as a physicist. It's inertia only in the sense of how we try to talk about maintaining frequency stability. But it is a form of inertia because what's backing it up has high physical inertia. The analogy that I've used, I think, may be the best for people to understand is if you have a cookie sheet of water and you jostle it, it's really easy to cause the water to spill over the side of the cookie sheet. But if you have a giant bucket, a barrel full of water, and jostle it the same way, there's nothing spilling over the side. So in the electrical sense, what you want is the giant barrel full of water.
Right.
If you're fighting inertia. But let's go to a different issue. That's the dynamic control challenge, which eventually gets solved technologically. There's no question about that. It will take time. It'll cost money, especially at scale. Here's the other challenge. Your organization's end-of-year report, your annual report on forecast, the state and forecast of U.S. grid reliability. I don't know, it was the first time I noticed that someone NERC is actually talking about the Dunkelflaute problem, which in your report is correctly called, the drought problem. They don't mean water drought, but when you have no wind for a day or two or days, and you have no sun for a day or two or days, those are solar and wind droughts. And there's a combined feature, the CDM, the combined, what's it called? Forget the acronym.
We just call it Dunkelflaute, because that's a much funner word to say.
But you can have both occur simultaneously for 1 to 2. So meteorologically, we have data that over decades, as you design grids, you can have days of no wind resource and no solar resource over massive areas of the geography.
Right.
That is, to me, not only a critical feature, what's in your latest reliability forecast, but almost completely ignored by all the proponents of high-density use of wind and solar on grids.
Yeah, it's a real puzzle, and we've seen events like this even in the recent history. We haven't seen the massive, continent-wide, no wind, no solar event, but we've seen massive solar droughts and massive wind droughts happen independently. The biggest one was June 6, 2022, where across the backbone of the country we've got about 60 gigawatts of installed wind, and that's like the best wind resource in the world, right there. Saudi Arabia wind, and that's not an overstatement. And on June 6, 2022, 300 megawatts was running.
Out of 60 gigawatts.
Out of 60 gigawatts.
0.3 running out of 60.
Yeah. Fortunately, it was a low load day, so we didn't have any customer outages as a result.
And fortunately, you also had running on that grid?
Well, you had a lot of other stuff running.
Yeah, like coal and gas.
We had coal, gas, and nuclear. But, if something like that happened in August, right, when it's really, really hot, then that's a real problem. And we would have had significant outages. Back in September 2023, 22, I forget which year it was, when they had the heat dome over California, and the governor, Newsom, had to send out a text message telling everybody, shut off your air conditioners right now. That was because there was a unanticipated marine layer. Took out a lot of the solar in Southern California. So we got to have tools for dealing with this, and we don't have them today. Well, we do have them today. They're called fossil fuels and inventoried fuels, right. So fossil fuels and nuclear, hydro as well. Batteries don't have the duration to be able to last that long, nor do we have them at the scale we would need.
Well, that's, of course.
So that's a big opportunity for us, too.
the narrative that's pushed out, unfortunately, certainly in clickbait land, another technical term, of course, which is actually a technical term now, the use of batteries in MISO, your MISO example, the Mid-Atlantic outage of 10 days, if you just did arithmetic for that region and said, well, we're going to in fact use batteries to pick up those 10 days, and you assume future battery prices, not today's, you get to trillions of dollars of batteries would have to be built, trillions, not billions, to keep the lights on if the goal was to use batteries by overproducing wind and solar when it was available and then riding out the Dunkelflaute. I mean, obviously that's not what's going to happen. It doesn't matter what number you imagine for future battery prices.
Yeah.
So we'll do what Germany did, which will have 2 grids, which is inherently expensive.
Yeah, and I mean, who knows, 20 years from now what technology breakthroughs might come through, sure. But certainly using the technology we have today, it's going to be very, very challenging to meet those kinds of, impossible to meet those kinds of numbers. The one thing, though, is I think it's also important to say that batteries, as they're coming on the grid right now, are playing a very, very valuable role, right? We see that in California. Right. We see that in Texas.
Managing transitions, shoulders.
Absolutely.
Short-term, cloud cover comes over.
They make it much easier to integrate large amounts of solar onto the grid without tearing apart the natural gas fleet that has to otherwise balance.
But they also enable, which we'll hear later in this program, they enable capacity expansion. Get more headroom on transmission if you can actually do a little more dynamic management.
No, that's probably true. That's probably true. Batteries can also kind of help on frequency response. We're seeing that in Texas right now. And the solar battery combination is really a killer summer generating resource. In areas where you have good, reliable sunshine. So, the desert Southwest, Texas, don't do a whole lot for you in the winter. They don't hurt in the winter, but they don't help a lot. So it reminds me of the old adage that, it's kind of a horses for courses thing. Any one resource can be good for one thing, but not everything. And that's true of gas, it's true of coal, it's true of nuclear. All these things have value in a mix. And one of the things that I really worry about is that we kind of continue to march down a path of removing diversity from the grid.
Well, I mean, you should worry about it. I mean, in the role that you have.
It's my job.
It's your job. And it's important. It becomes obvious when the lights go out why power matters. It's also obvious why we take for granted when we've run grids successfully at such high levels of reliability for so long, that the sort of operating assumption is, and I'll paraphrase this in an unkind way, a lot of the tech community looks at the utility industry, that's the old industry, and they're obviously troglodytes, anchored in an old technology. They don't get it. Technology, the pace of change. We gotta just get these old guys and gals out of the way and put the new stuff in, mandates, subsidies. But it's a misdirection in terms of what's really possible, in terms of keeping the grid reliable. Critically, at a reasonable price, reasonable cost.
At a reasonable price, at a reasonable cost, and across a broad range of conditions. I think one of the things that we're really learning, with the weather systems that we're seeing over the last, 6 or 7 years, maybe 10, 15, right? We're seeing these broader, deeper, longer cold spells like Enzo we had earlier this year, Elliott a couple years ago, Uri that took out the grid in Texas. The key thing there is that what we're finding is that, it's easy to design things for the fat part of the curve, but getting things that work in those tails, which are becoming more extreme and more problematic. And by the way, that's when people really, really need power. Right, is when you're in an extreme situation where, it's freezing outside, you gotta have heat. If it's really, really hot outside, you gotta have a way to cool people down. And it's those tail events that are becoming so critical, both for the power grid to be able to design for, but to be able to deliver against, because that's where the kind of the health and human service part of the grid becomes so critical.
That's when the reliability matters the most, on the tails.
On the tails.
And your latest reliability report pointed out something that's meteorologically interesting. It's that the droughts, the Dunkelflautes, tend to happen statistically more often at periods of high demand, which is on the tails of the curves.
Yeah.
Which creates an even bigger problem. We only have another minute. I don't want to let my gas friends off the hook in terms of something else you warned about in your report. The concern as we push more and more gas into electric generation, which we need to and will, at looking upstream at the predictability of the inherent reliability of that system to deliver and store gas. We're still short storage east of the Appalachians, as far as I know.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the challenges we're going to have with the gas fleet going forward is we're going to see likely average gas volumes decline as we displace gas generation with other fuels like wind and solar, but the peak needs are going to go up significantly, and maybe 10 times the rate at which the average declines. So the gas business hasn't added any material storage over the last dozen or so years, and that's going to become a really, really big driver of electric reliability.
And I think that'll be a political issue of non-trivial consequence. So our time is up. I want to join me in thanking Jim for taking the time to come and help us out.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you.
Good deal.
Well done.